Hi, everybody. Welcome to a special bonus episode of My Favorite Mistake. I'm your host, Mark Graban. Our guest today is Arnold Barnett. He joined us back in episode 169. So if you want to hear his favorite mistake story, I'll point you to that in the show notes. But Arnie is the George Eastman Professor of Management Science at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He's been cited as the nation's leading expert on aviation safety, which is why I wanted to talk to Arnie today. He was recognized with the 2002 President's Citation from the Flight Safety Foundation for truly outstanding contributions on behalf of safety. And MIT Sloan students have honored him on 14 occasions for outstanding teaching. So Arnie has a BA in mathematics from Columbia and a PhD in mathematics from MIT. So Arnie, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. How are you?
I'm fine and very happy to be here.
Yeah, I hope you don't look back and think it was a mistake to come on the podcast that first time. I enjoyed having you here.
No, it was not a mistake.
Good. So the topic that has been in the news and is on a lot of people's mind is the safety of air travel, especially here in the U.S. I've heard people comment to me even yesterday that they don't feel safe flying right now. Is it a mistake to think that aviation, air travel in the U.S. has suddenly become less safe?
I think that is a mistake. Mm-hmm. First of all, it's just common sense. Yes, it's true that in the last month or two, we have had a number of events, some of them unnerving, a few of them fatal. Mm-hmm. And one might look at that and say, my goodness, I had thought flying was safe. I never gave a second thought, and now I can't do anything but give thought to it. But, there's no reason to believe, for example, that our ability to fly safely now is lower than that 2 months ago or 3 months ago or 4 months ago, when we went month after month after month without a single incident that took a single injury, let alone a death. So I mean, that I wouldn't expect to be a sign of something systematic. It's also true when you're dealing with rare events. Actually, the laws of probability say you're going to go for some long periods when nothing happens, interspersed with others when you have a burst of events, a temporary spasm of luck, bad luck, if it's the events are unhappy events. And I think that is the most reasonable explanation for what's happening now. Mm-hmm. So I don't take it seriously and think I'm at greater risk now than I was, let's say, 2 months ago. Actually, the opposite, because, for example, I fly sometimes into Washington's Reagan Airport, mm-hmm. and now we know that the paths of helicopters and the paths of the airplanes were shockingly close together. In fact, the New York Times said at one point the prescribed altitudes are only 15 feet apart, as the planes were on the final approach to landing, and the helicopters had an upper limit of 200, and the planes had a lower limit at one point of 215 over the Potomac. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we're not going to see those helicopters now. They've been drastically reduced over there. And in that sense, we never knew we were at such potential risk. But tragically, we now know there was such risk and it had terrible consequences. But now I think the risk has drastically diminished. And I think that's happened again and again. There are things in aviation we've learned the hard way, and they have prevented tragedies in the future. But we're also learning in other ways that don't necessarily involve deaths. They used to say the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, had a tombstone mentality, meaning it was only after crashes that they started making reforms and offering proposals. I don't think that's as true today. Mm-hmm. So I mean, the risks are minimal. A soundbite I've used is, if you see a little kid at an American airport, then that kid, whether it's male, female, whatever, I don't want to get into pronouns now, but that person is 5 times as likely to grow up to be president as to perish in the forthcoming flight. Mm-hmm. So if you look at this kid and say, he'll never be president, think of how minimal is the risk on the flight he's about to take or the flight that you would take.
Yeah. And I know one thing you taught us and you've talked about is even on a really simple scale, flipping a coin.
Yes.
That people might not bat an eye about getting two heads in a row, but then there's a certain point where if you flip the coin enough, you very well could get six, or you will get 6, 7, 8 in a row. I mean, can you sort of talk about that and where maybe as just people in general, why we struggle to wrap our heads around things that are rare but certain to happen?
Well, in terms of the coin, it's a very good source of an analogy. Let's suppose I have a coin that's fair, meaning in the long run, half the time heads, half the time tails. The molecular structure does not change when I toss it. Well, if you started tossing it and recorded the outcomes, a lot of the time you get tails, heads, tails. In other words, pretty much bobbing randomly, heads and tails. But as you say, it's inevitable that it won't be that long, actually, before you suddenly have a sequence of 5 or 6 heads in a row or 7 or 8 tails in a row. And if you look at that sequence in isolation and say the coin is biased, you're missing the fact that even in the absence of bias, you're going to have individual outcomes that might, to the naked eye, suggest the opposite. And I think that's what's happening now as far as the events involving planes in the last month or two. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand, though, that, the way we interpret risk is not, extraordinarily scientific. I mean, there are all kinds of projects that have shown, people like Tversky and Kahneman in particular talked about the fallacies that we suffer when we try to assess which risks are large and which risks are small. And it's natural. We're human beings. And when you hear about events like this, there's something the psychologists call availability bias, mm-hmm. where what they're saying is if you see how something could happen, then you start worrying that it will happen, even if you know that the risk is infinitesimal. Okay? So, yes, a plane landing at Washington's Reagan Airport could hit a helicopter. And you could say, gee, I could have been on that plane. I've flown into Reagan on the planes of the same type. And so people think, gee, that could have happened to me. And that's true. It could have happened to you, but the chance it would have happened to you is extraordinarily low. Mm-hmm. But so I do think that at the moment people are overly upset. But also we've gone so long without any of these events that I imagine people didn't even think about the risk of flying. There are so many things we do, and you think about it, everything we do entails some risk. I mean, you go into the grocery store, the ceiling could collapse in a way that injures or even kills you. But I don't know about you. I don't worry about that when I go into the supermarket. So in the same way, when we drive, when we eat, every now and then, like you see something in the paper, they found listeria in these oats or something. And you think you could have been the person with the bad luck who is the one who reminds people that there's a danger. But we can't stop eating and say, what if there's something wrong with this food? Mm-hmm. Or, as I said, more generally, we we have to assume that when risks are if close enough to zero, we have to proceed as if they were actually zero. That's how we can live our lives. Mm. And I'm saying that I believe aviation, and it's a miracle actually, mm-hmm. is so safe that it should be in that category. Mm.
So is there a level of incidents, let's say measured in terms of incidents or fatalities per million passenger miles? Is there a certain level where you would say, that it does seem like that's bucking the trend, as you've written about, and I'll put a link in the show notes to how aviation safety has gotten progressively safer over time? I mean, is there a certain level where you would say, well, that trend seems to have stalled out or reversed?
Well, one could certainly keep looking at data. Mm-hmm. And, I've said that plane crashes, accidental crashes, have been brought to the brink of extinction, but many a near extinct species has staged a comeback.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not out of the question. For example, in automobile safety in the US, if you look at the numbers, progressively the risk, the deaths per 100 million miles driven was going down, down, down. And then it did take an upturn
Mm-hmm.
in recent years. So it's certainly not inevitable that you'll keep what you have or continue to improve. However, one thing I've noticed, in terms of computer chips, there's Moore's law
Mm-hmm.
about factor of two improvements. And one of the things I've noticed in the data, if you simply look at the worldwide risk, if I pick a boarding pass at random from a passenger anywhere in the world, what's the chance that person would be killed? Well, it has been going down at a rate of a factor of two every decade since the end of World War II, when commercial aviation essentially began with passengers. And that means it's a factor of two less than a decade ago, a factor of four less than 2 decades ago. It's happened. And even as it got safer and safer, and you might think it's harder to continue improving at the same rate, it has continued to improve at the same rate. So even though I would intuitively think there must be some lower bound greater than zero, such that you really can't cross it because we're human. But even so, no matter how low it's gotten, it's continued to improve at a factor of two. In fact, even if you look at the last few months, including that terrible crash in South Korea, where the plane hit a concrete barrier, burst into flames, 179 deaths, even if you include those data and do the calculation for the last few months,
Mm-hmm.
it's about a factor of two lower than it was for the decade prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I would say yes, it is theoretically possible that things will, as you say, stall out or even reverse. But I don't anticipate that. The one thing I do worry about is deliberate attacks on aviation.
Mm-hmm.
And those can come about in a number of ways. It can be old-fashioned terrorism. It could be the plane is shot out of the sky, perhaps accidentally, because people think it's a military plane in a war zone. Of course, that's a strange concept, a deliberate accident. It's deliberate that you shot it down, but accidental in the sense that you didn't realize it was a commercial plane. And you have crazy people like pilots who basically crash the planes. I think the latest consensus is that Malaysia 370, the plane that disappeared, was destroyed by the captain.
Mm-hmm.
It's not known for sure, but a consensus for many reasons has moved toward that. And we had a plane shot down late last year in I don't know how to pronounce it actually. It was shot down over Russia accidentally, related to the kinds of fighting that's going on there. So those are the things that could conceivably occur again. In the U.S., we really haven't had any aviation terrorism since 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
And 9/11, after all, is now roughly a quarter century ago.
Right.
But before 9/11, if you actually looked at the data, as I have, there were quite a few events in quick succession, including, for example, Pan Am 103,
Mm-hmm.
which was destroyed by a bomb, and several other planes were destroyed by bombs, etc., in that period. And then it stopped on 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
Could it resume again? I hope not. Certainly the security is better now than it used to be, but you don't know. But again, worrying about what might be a source of risk, that's even a new level of anxiety. Instead of being anxious because of actual events, being anxious because of hypothetical events. I think if one could be very unhappy if one spends one's life thinking that way, which isn't to say one shouldn't do some thinking about potential risks that haven't emerged yet. But on the other hand, I think the fact that aviation is so safe is something I think we can count on.
Yeah. And so what I hear you saying maybe is a final point is, you say the risk of something bad happening to you on a particular flight or even in a lifetime of flying is so close to zero, it's essentially zero. And I'm trying to remember if this is something you talked about in class or if this is just the general aviation safety notion that it seems like the most dangerous moments are takeoff and landing. And so you might
Yes.
think, well, taking a direct flight would be, doing a connecting flight where you have 2 ups and 2 downs would be twice as dangerous as a direct flight. But I hear you saying 2 times 0 is still 0.
Well, I think you are right that if you just look at when these events occurred, for example, the crash at Reagan occurred very much on final approach. The previous crash, which had double-digit deaths, was on landing in Buffalo during a storm when icing conditions, I believe, led to instability when they were landing the plane. So you are right. And yes, the risk is mostly for accidental risk is mostly on takeoff or on landing. That is true. But as you say, it's extremely close to 0. One thing to remember is every day around the world, 12 million people get on airplanes. It's about 5 billion a year. And if you work it out, that's 12 million a day. And the overwhelming majority of days, not a single person is injured, let alone killed. So even yesterday, for example, 12 million flew, 0 affected, as far as I know. The day before, 12 million, 0, etc. So the numbers are extraordinary. And one other thing, another way of putting it, I've developed sound bites over time, is that the risk that now prevails in the United States or in comparable countries like the UK, those in the European Union, mainland China has an excellent safety record, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Israel, Japan. In these countries, if you were to take one flight a day at the prevailing level of mortality risk, on average, you could fly for 300,000 years before succumbing to a fatal crash. And I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I don't think we're going to live 300,000 years.
Fair. Yes, I think that's fair to say. Final thought. I was thinking about you and the story you told back in episode 169, where you were thinking it was back when U.S. Airways had what you'd called, a spasm of bad luck events. They had a number of crashes, and somebody called you, a reporter called you, and you said, "That's amazing."
Yes.
Like you didn't mean it in a positive way. You maybe ask you to recap. And I invite people to go to listen to the whole episode. You were using the word amazing in a way that's true to the dictionary.
Yes, amazing meaning shocking.
Yes.
Yeah, certainly I was not expressing joy at hearing about the Pittsburgh crash.
No, but I thought of you because if I remember right, I think it was Mary Schiavo on CNN, who I believe she was the former head of the National Transportation Safety Board. And she used that same word in the same way, in the same tone that you had meant it, that it's shocking. It doesn't mean that it's great.
Yes. But on the other hand, as I said, I did consider it a mistake, as we discussed in podcast 169. On the other hand, it was, I think, a kind of natural reaction. Of course, it might just be a fluke, but somehow at a certain level, what? And what was unfortunate then was that quote was used as if to say, don't treat this as a fluctuation. This wouldn't have happened on its own. It's amazing. So let's not talk about it. And that was a mistake. It turned out that people at U.S. Air, which became U.S. Airways and now is a part of American Airlines, they were the ones who helped discover the subtle problem with the rudder that caused that crash, that also caused a previous crash on United. And the rudder has been corrected since then.
Yeah.
So not only were they were the victims of bad luck, and that it could have happened to any Boeing 737, and they didn't even have the largest fleet, U.S. Airways. Southwest did. So you would think if one of those planes was going to exhibit this fatal flaw, the law's averages say would be the ones that have more 737s, but it didn't happen that way. Yeah. So that genuinely was a fluctuation. But yes, it was, I think, a mistake to yell "Holy cow!"
Well, I appreciate you telling the story back then, and I appreciate you coming on to provide some some reassurance to us that you wouldn't be any more worried about getting on a plane with me or the listener today compared to a year or 10 years ago. So thank you for those perspectives. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes, an article that was on the MIT website from late last year with the data that Arnie was talking about, this parallel to Moore's law in aviation. And I encourage people to check that out and maybe try to be reassuring if someone you know has a new fear of flying. So I want to thank you for sharing those perspectives, with us and being a guest again.
If I can say one more anecdote, though,
yeah,
I got a call from someone once, and these days, of course, with the web, etc., people know you, even if you don't know them. And it was someone who was thinking of going over to the UK for her grandmother's funeral and was just feeling very frightened about flying. So I said to her, in fact, I'm surprised at my own rudeness talking of mistakes. I said, "May I ask how old you are?" And she said 34. I said, "Do you realize over your entire lifespan, British Airways has never had a fatal crash?" And she said, "Oh, I didn't know that."
Yeah.
So I said to her, "So I'm sorry for the circumstances that you're going to the UK, but I don't think you should worry and should have a nice trip."
Yeah.
Anyway, I learned later she didn't go.
Oh.
No, fears are deep, and when I respect them, I know many people who are afraid to fly, and some who will take ships or trains rather than fly, even though statistically they're putting themselves at greater risk. So I really understand the fears, but I believe this is something we shouldn't be afraid of.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Arnie. We've been joined return visit by Professor Arnold Barnett from the MIT Sloan School of Management, and I think rightfully so, aviation safety expert. I tried making him a patient safety expert. That was my mistake.
We could use many patient safety experts. That's a place where the risk is still much too high.
That is true as well. So, Arnie, thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
As always, I want to thank you for listening. I hope this podcast inspires you to reflect on your own mistakes, how you can learn from them or turn them into a positive. I've had listeners tell me they started being more open and honest about mistakes in their work. And they're trying to create a workplace culture where it's safe to speak up about problems, because that leads to more improvement and better business results. If you have feedback or a story to share, you can email me, myfavoritemistakepodcast@gmail.com. And again, our website is myfavoritemistakepodcast.com.